Right now, missiles are flying in the Strait of Hormuz, ships are being targeted, oil infrastructure is under attack, and multiple militaries are operating in the same waters with no clear rules of engagement. This is not a drill, this is not a warning, this is happening right now, and it's unfolding in the single most important oil choke point on the planet. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious where this conversation is reaching. And if this kind of analysis is useful to you, if you want more of it, hit subscribe. No noise, no filler, just the stories that actually matter, broken down properly. Now let's get into what's happening. As of the morning of May 4th, 2026, we are watching a situation that is developing in real time. The ceasefire that had been in place between the United States and Iran, fragile, contested, never particularly stable, appears to be coming apart. Not through a formal announcement, not through a declaration of war, but through the oldest mechanism in the history of conflict, two sides pushing until someone pushes back, and then both sides pushing harder. Let me walk you through what we actually know, and then let's talk about what it means. Late Sunday night, President Trump made an announcement. He called it Project Freedom. The stated objective was straightforward: restore freedom of navigation for commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Central Command confirmed it early Monday morning. Their language was careful. This was described as a coordination effort combining diplomatic action with military support. The assets committed were not insignificant: guided missile destroyers, over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, 15,000 service members, multi-domain unmanned platforms. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is a combat-ready force. Now, the way Trump framed it publicly made it sound like an escort mission, U.S. Navy vessels moving into the strait alongside merchant ships and physically shepherding them through. CENTCOM's language was somewhat more measured, more of a coordination framework than a convoy operation. But here's the thing, whatever you call it, the effect is the same. The United States is saying ships will move through the Strait of Hormuz, full stop. Iran's response was immediate and it was unambiguous. IRGC Brigadier General Hussein Salami, the IRGC spokesperson, came out within hours and said, in essence, nothing has changed. The strait is still under our management. Any vessel that follows IRGC transit protocols and moves along our designated corridor will be allowed safe passage. Any vessel that does not will be stopped by force. And to underscore that point, the IRGC issued a new map, a map showing the only permissible transit corridor through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow sliver of water running right along the Iranian coastline. That is not freedom of navigation. That is a toll road with guns on both sides. So by Monday morning, you had two completely incompatible declarations sitting side by side. United States, ships will move freely. Iran, ships will move only where we say, and only if they follow our rules. Something had to give. What happened next is where the morning gets complicated and where you have to be careful about separating confirmed facts from competing claims. Iranian state media, specifically Tasnim news agency, put out a report claiming that two Iranian missiles had struck an American patrol boat after the vessel disregarded Iranian warnings. That claim circulated widely and quickly. U.S. Central Command responded within a short window, flatly denying it. No U.S. Navy ships have been struck, they said. U.S. forces are supporting Project Freedom and enforcing the naval blockade on Iranian ports. Here's my read on that. The denial from CENTCOM is credible. They have no incentive to lie about taking a hit. And in fact, acknowledging an attack on a U.S. vessel would give them more justification for escalation, not less. But I also don't think you can fully dismiss the Iranian claim either. Here's why. The timing of that report coincided with multiple independent confirmations from across the region of actual missile launches. Multiple sources not affiliated with each other were reporting launches in and around the strait at approximately the same time the Iranians said they had fired. So the missiles were real. Whether they hit an American vessel, whether they missed, whether they were intercepted, whether they targeted something else entirely, that we don't know yet. But something was flying. What we do know with more certainty is this. At least 3 or 4 commercial vessels in the past 24 hours have reported being targeted or struck by Iranian drones or missiles. The UK Maritime Trade Organization logged multiple incidents in and around the strait. No confirmed casualties at the time of this recording, but multiple confirmed impacts. These are merchant ships, cargo vessels, the kind of ships that Project Freedom was designed to protect, and they are being hit. Then the situation widened. Missile warnings began going out across the United Arab Emirates, air raid alerts, civilian shelter advisories, multiple warnings within the span of a few hours. And this is not a surprise to anyone who is paying attention to the first phase of this conflict. The UAE was, by some counts, the most heavily targeted country in the region during the initial wave of Iranian strikes, more so even than Israel. The logic is clear. The UAE hosts major U.S. military installations. It serves as the financial and logistical hub for much of the region's commercial activity, and hitting it sends a message to everyone simultaneously. But this morning, it went further than alerts and near misses. There is now confirmation that the Fujairah oil industry zone has been struck. Fujairah is in the northeastern corner of the UAE, right at the mouth of the Gulf of Oman, and it is not a random target. It is the only fully operational oil refinery and maritime fuel facility in the country. It also happens to be the main alternative loading point that tankers have been using to bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. If you can't get through the strait, you route your tanker around the UAE coast to Fujairah and load there. Iran just hit that exit. They are not leaving any doors open. This is consistent with what Iran has been signaling for weeks. Their stated doctrine for escalation has always been, if you push us hard enough, we go after oil infrastructure. Not just Iranian oil infrastructure, regional oil infrastructure. The message is, the pain you are causing us, we will redistribute across the entire global economy. Oil markets this morning are responding accordingly. Prices are spiking. That is not incidental. That is the point. Now, let me step back from the immediate tactical picture and explain the strategic context, because without it, what's happening this morning looks like chaos. It isn't. It's actually a fairly rational, if extremely dangerous, set of moves by both sides. Here is the core dynamic. Iran has been running a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz since the start of this conflict. The purpose was coercive, shut down the flow of global commerce, impose economic pain on the international community, and generate enough diplomatic pressure on the United States and Israel to force concessions. It worked, in the sense that it created real damage. Global shipping costs went through the roof. Insurance premiums for vessels in the Gulf became essentially prohibitive for smaller operators. Oil prices elevated. The world felt it. The United States responded a few weeks ago with a mirror strategy, a naval blockade of all Iranian ports. Any Iranian vessel trying to exit or enter through the strait would be stopped. The logic was to turn Iran's own weapon back on them. If they can strangle global commerce, we can strangle your economy specifically. Make the pain asymmetric enough, and the Iranian regime comes to the table. Both of these strategies take time to work. And here is the uncomfortable reality that nobody in Washington or Tehran wants to say out loud. Neither side can actually afford to wait. The United States is dealing with a global economy that is already under significant stress. If the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed for another 6 months, let alone a year, the economic consequences are not contained to Iran. They ripple through Europe, through Asia, through every country that moves goods or fuel through that waterway. You've been hearing administration officials in recent days dropping hints about Iran's oil wells going dry, about their economy being 3 days from collapse. Some of that is genuine intelligence. Some of that is psychological pressure, but the undertone is, we need this to end, because the blockade is hurting everyone. Iran faces the mirror image of that calculation. Their economy was already fragile before this war started. Years of sanctions, structural mismanagement, a currency that had been in freefall before the first missile was ever launched. The idea that they can sustain an extended military confrontation with the United States while their oil revenue is cut off and their ports are blockaded, that is not a strategy. That is a prayer. They need a way out too. So what you have is two sides, both under time pressure, both making moves that look aggressive but are actually signals. Signals that say, we are still here, we still have capacity, you cannot simply wait us out. But also, someone needs to find a way to close this out. Project Freedom, in that context, was a calculated move. Not just an escort mission, a test. You push a couple of guided missile destroyers through the Strait of Hormuz and you see what happens. If Iran stands down and lets them through, you've demonstrated that the blockade is porous, that U.S. military presence can reopen the waterway, and commercial shipping can gradually resume. That changes the whole negotiating dynamic. If Iran fires, well, then you have justification for the next phase of military operations that's been sitting on the shelf since the ceasefire started. There is an argument, and I think it has some merit, that Iran launched this morning's offensive preemptively, precisely because they saw what was coming. They have been watching U.S. force deployment for weeks. They have heard the rhetoric about bombing campaigns and oil field strikes, and their calculation may well have been better to move now before American aircraft are overhead, before our rebuilt launch sites and missile facilities become the primary targets. Strike the oil infrastructure, strike commercial vessels, force the situation to a head on their terms rather than waiting to absorb a blow. That is not an irrational calculation. It is a desperate one, but desperation and irrationality are not the same thing. What I want you to pay attention to in the hours ahead is whether the United States moves from a defensive posture to an offensive one. So far this morning, there has been no indication of U.S. offensive strikes being launched. The posture has been protect freedom of navigation, enforce the blockade, respond to direct attacks on U.S. assets. But Iran has now struck oil infrastructure in a U.S. partner state. It has targeted commercial vessels. It has, at minimum, fired in the direction of U.S. Navy ships. At some point, that crosses a threshold that requires a kinetic response. The question is what that response looks like and whether it is calibrated to de-escalate or to escalate. A targeted, proportionate strike on the missile batteries that have been launching today, that is a de-escalation signal wrapped in military force. It says we can do this all day and you can't. Come talk to us. A broad strike campaign targeting Iranian energy infrastructure, command centers, and IRGC facilities, that is a different message entirely. That is the opening move of a new phase of war. Both are on the table. Which one gets chosen depends on decisions being made in Washington right now and on how much damage is done in the next few hours. Here is the bottom line as I see it. The ceasefire in any meaningful operational sense is over. The shooting is restarted. The question now is whether this escalates into a sustained second phase of the conflict or whether the violence of the next 24 to 72 hours produces enough pain on both sides. It accelerates a negotiated settlement. Paradoxically, sometimes a sharp escalation is what breaks a stalemate. Both sides have been locked in a slow attrition. Blockades, economic pressure, back-channel talks going nowhere. A kinetic exchange of this magnitude changes the calculus. It reminds both governments and their populations of what the alternative to a deal actually looks like. But that outcome requires someone to be willing to take the first step toward the table. Right now, both sides are still taking steps toward each other, and the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles of water that the entire global economy depends on, is in the middle. Pay attention to what happens next. The next few hours matter more than most. And if you made it this far, if you stayed through all of that, then you know this channel is worth your time. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. And I'll see you in the next one.